it a flood in an area, like Linda said, because they're at sea level and close to that, and then maybe it's a tsunami or something that floods an area that's your known world, but but may not have really impacted the people 40 miles uphill or whatever. Ralph?
In listening to some of the documentaries that I do, there's a theory out that polar ice caps and stuff were melting, and the water was dammed up by previous dams and stuff, and they broke with the huge amount of water. They broke and flooded the area.
Okay.
I think if I'm not mistaken, I think the Black Sea over there is one of the places that they're talking about.
All right. So
Yeah, Christian Leonard.
okay. Did you guys have?
No, I was just talking about you telling me the story. Was it your uncle killed in the first that flood back in 1973 or whatever?
Right.
And you said they were trying to warn people.
Right.
They're like, there's
Exactly.
it's sunny out. There's no water that's going to come down the canyon.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly what Peggy said. Yeah, he was on his second trip up the canyon with his loudspeaker on the top of his cop car, trying to tell them to get away, because they were all camping and picnicking right down along the side of the Big Thompson River, and he was trying to tell them, you need to go to higher ground, and they see sunny skies and not a cloud in the sky, and they're thinking this guy's nuts. And so, half an hour later, they're all gone.
In 1953, the Missouri River flooded and just about wiped out the south side of Sioux City, Iowa.
Okay.
I was living in Sioux City, Iowa at the time, and we were down there after some of the water had gone down, because my uncle had a house down there. We're going to see if he's still there. And my little sister saved my life. Dad told us not to go out there, and I got a spanking for that. But anyway, what happened was there was a cistern, and the lid had been floated off of the water, and it was mud sort of like dried on there, and I stepped on it, and down I went. And my little sister, who was about 18 months younger than me, she grabbed a branch and put it over for me to hold on until she could pull me out. I'll never forget that.
No, I know you wouldn't. You wouldn't forget that.
She'd never let me forget it either.
Well, probably not. Sisters are like that.
I think it's interesting because of all the flood stories, and I was online and they're talking about China,
Right.
and there has a flood story.
Right.
And people that were in Mesoamerica have a flood story.
Right.
And but that's one of the points that they like to use to say that that having so many different flood stories kind of proves that the flood was global.
Okay.
As depicted in.
Okay. All right. So
I've got a whole big book that shows evidence of floods all over the world, but none of them can be correlated to mean that they all happen at the same time.
Same time.
There is floods.
Right. Right.
And
everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. So, anything else in his article that really jumped out at you?
It says, but then this story does something strange. It ends with the divine insistence that's never going to happen again. And then this God brings a rainbow and a promise and a covenant.
When I was a little girl, and I can't remember who told me this, but it scared the living daylights out of me. God gave a rainbow saying no more floods. So the next time he wipes out everybody, it's going to be with fire. And I think that is the reason this should not, if you believe in an inerrant Bible, you're going to believe that number one, God doesn't mind. He might just feel a little bit bad about it, but wiping out all of his children, just except for a family, and they weren't the best. And number two is we teach this to children, what is it, to scare the living daylights out of them, that if you're bad, God can do this to you. He doesn't really care. I mean, I know that Rob Bell says, okay, this God was better. He made a covenant.
Right.
That he would never flood the world again. But good Christian people came up with a theory that, well, he wouldn't flood us, but he would burn us.
So, okay, all right. So, but I guess my question is, have we evolved from that place of believing that God caused all these things to happen? Can we tell the flood story and not necessarily blame it directly on God?
In this church, we can. To most people, I mean, I don't know whether every congregation you go to, but right here, I think we can do it.
Okay.
But I talked to a lady who goes to a mega church, and I said, okay, could you teach us Rob Bell stuff? And she's met Rob Bell, because she goes to Christian Writers Conferences. And she said, oh, no. Our church was founded on the theory, they broke away from the Episcopalians because the Episcopalians were getting away from the fact that the Bible was in error. So, no, we haven't evolved as a whole. I think the secular world, yes, but Christianity, not all entirely.
Okay. Other thoughts? What do you think about like either what Rose is talking about or about because like Melinda mentioned, one of the things that makes this story, the Noah flood story, different is that it would appear that in the other flood stories, the flood was sort of the end of the story. But the writers of this story, the Noah story, wanted us to understand that God wants to be in relationship with God's people, and so God continually makes covenant with us and renews covenant with us to help us to continue to understand that God doesn't desert us, but that God wants to be with us and us with God. So that's apparently different than the other flood stories.
Is that, I mean, what is the redeeming value of the story?
Well, it would seem that yeah, I think what Rob is saying is that you have to remember that the stories were there. Everybody was talking about flood stories, and everybody in those days believed that those kinds of things were a direct correlation between us messing up and God. And so I think that the reason that this story was kept and written was that whole idea of the covenant and the reconciliation, and the fact that even though there may have been a flood that destroyed large parts of the earth, I mean, the reality is floods have killed people since then. Not a whole worldwide flood, but certainly floods have killed people since then. So for that person, they might question God's promise and God's covenant because they lost somebody. I mean, I lost an uncle in that flood, so I don't know, it's interesting.
Well, I think to the Jewish people, this story would be really important because their whole life was revolved around worshiping the one God that's in covenant with them, that makes them the chosen people. And so I think that they would be, that's why they would hang on to this story, because their God is different. They've got the rainbow that every time they see it, they remember God's promise to them as a covenant people. So for the Jews, I think it would be very important to have this passed down orally from generation. And then later, part of their compilation of how God had worked with them since the beginning of time, I guess.
Yeah,
So I would think to the Jewish people, this would be very important to have around in their writings.
yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that makes a lot of sense why that story would be important to them as they were putting together their story, like Melinda said, because their God was different than the gods that other people were writing about.
He's still very angry.
That God does appear to be angry at times, that's true.
But that's Old Testament. You
Yeah.
know, our God is angry in the Old Testament. They didn't know about the God of love until New Testament times.
But that God that we're talking about made a covenant with people, that he wanted to be in relationship with them. So it's interesting because he does appear to be a God of love, and then he made them this promise that they would be his people and that he would take care of them. So it's kind of a strange dichotomy a little bit where it's like they're walking with a foot on each side of the line. On one side of that line, their God is angry and causes boils and pestilence and floods and all kinds of things because they keep messing up. But on the other side, they keep telling these stories about a God that loves them and covenants with them and continues to covenant with them, even though they continue to screw up. So it's kind of like they're walking with one foot on each side of the line, isn't it?
Well, he says it right here, but this God is different. This God commits to living with people in a new way, a way in which life is preserved and respected.
Yeah.
It's all right there.
So
And the other side
After
of the
he
line,
killed everybody.
the other side of the line's grace, right?
well,
That would be.
I mean, they can't seem to let go of this idea that both good and bad are caused directly by God, but yet they still worship a God that they believe wants to covenant with them and forgive them and be with them. So like I said, I think they struggle back and forth being on both sides of that line. John?
It'd be interesting to look up and see whether the area that was flooded at that time, if it's ever been flooded since.
Yeah, I mean, I would, I don't know the answer to that.
I would guess probably. We're talking about hundreds of years between all these early primitive stories and I don't know.
Yeah,
So you think the redeeming value would be that we could look at it as more of a history lesson on how people were developing their concept of God.
I would say so.
yeah,
I'd say so.
yeah, that has an interesting ring to it.
And if you take the story as a story and not as fact or inerrant, I can see the redeeming value, as long as when children are involved, they understand that too.
Yeah, yeah,
I think it should not be taught to children until they're older, because I don't think that maybe the concept
okay,
that we're talking about would make any sense to them.
right.
I told Wayne Ham once in his class at MAR, he wanted to know, what would you do with the Old Testament? And I said, I would put it in an appendix as a history lesson, and then maybe have an appendectomy.
But I think, but I think what you said though, Rose, is I think that one of the values of the Old Testament is that it shows us the process, like you said, of people learning to understand God. Because I think it makes some of the things that happen in the New Testament even more powerful, because we understand the struggles that people went through walking with a foot on both sides of that line, trying to understand who God was and how God wanted to be involved with them as a people and how their understanding of God has grown. I mean, just look at our church history, in the couple hundred years that we've been around. Look at the progress in a sense that we've made. If you look at the 1830 days, you could say that was kind of Old Testament compared to where we're at today. And so you could say, well, what's the value of the first 120 sections of the Doctrine and Covenants? Well, the value of that is it shows the progress, it shows our own struggle to try to understand God even in our day and age.
We'll put that in the appendix.
A lot of it has been already put in, and an appendectomy was taking place. If you look, there are missing skips.
Any other thoughts on the flood story that spoke to you or jumped out at you?
Well, I want to know what happened to the fish.
Well, we'll do
The
that.
fish certainly didn't walk up into the ark 2 by 2.
That's a good point.
Next week is supposed to be about fish.
Yes, it is.
That's because they were in the water, they were fine.
So,
Oh, my goodness.
so God didn't destroy all of the fish?
No,
Just the land breeding creatures?
yes.
Just the mammals.
Well, the whales and dolphins, and they think a lot too, so maybe they were done evil in their hearts.
Well, at least they could live in the flood. I suppose, I don't know. See, that's the thing, like he's talking about, if you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what they did with all the elephant poop and all that stuff.
Well, the elephant poop is not a problem at all. You just shove it all inside the ship.
Well, that could be.
Oh, you use it to grow vegetables.
In the hydroponic gardens on the ark.
Right, okay.
So that's the value of this story. Early green environment. All right. Huh?
Bill Cosby would like.
Yeah, he would. Well, because I can't help but go back to his whole routine on Noah and the flood. And if you look down here, who's going to clean up this mess? Noah, how long can you tread water? Okay, so yeah, that was a great routine. That was pretty funny.
Even though he is a bad man.
Well, that's interesting.
Alleged bad.
Okay,
I was gonna,
By 14 women.
say,
20 now.
when I was on the internet looking at this, with all your choices that you can pick and read about stuff, and I actually got onto the atheist website, and so what they have to say about the flood story is exactly how could the boat be big enough, where are you going to put all that stuff, and in the view that they expressed, that there's no way you could believe this story or believe God, that there is a God, is because it's so ridiculous. The story is so ridiculous. And
So that's what their argument is?
yeah, that could not have happened because the story is so ridiculous. And so I thought it was really interesting how Roth doesn't make it about the reality of a boat big enough to hold everything, and what are you going to do with these inconsistencies in the story. You kind of take that like it's a fable, like it's a morality play, whose point is that God is willing to be in a covenant relationship with his people. And so that helped me to think about it in a bigger, rather than trying to think of it literally and then try to explain all these things that were probably not meant to be explained at all. If you think about the Jewish mind, the important thing was that their God made a promise to them. And they most of their history honored that.
Right.
I wonder, I would love to hear how modern day Jew takes that if it is faithful to him. I think Christianity is the ones who have come along and said, okay, these are not fables, these are the inerrant words.
I don't think the Jewish people ever, or at least in, the last years, thought that this was actual, factual history.
It
I
does,
think that they, yes. I think that, that for them it would be midrash, which is a teaching story.
Right. Right. Yeah, I know a Jewish lady, I could ask her. about that, just to kind of see how she looks at that. John?
You also have to take into consideration, at the time the story is about, all the animals of the world were different than what we know nowadays. It's what they knew as all the animals. And there's a lot of the animals that are on the world that they didn't know about at the time. So the ark would not have had to be as big as everybody tries to make it out to be.
And
I don't
that's,
think they had elephants in that part of the world. And how would you need to worry about the elephants?
They didn't have to worry about tigers, lions, a
and,
lot of them.
and that's probably true, but again, that's getting sort of back into the literal part of it, where we're trying to, then we're trying to determine and guess what animals would have been there. It's like we watched, I don't know if anybody watched the dog show. Melinda always likes to watch the dog show on after the parade, and it was on again last night. I think they said there's something like 195 breeds of dogs. And so.
That are recognized by the American Kennel Club.
Right.
There are actually more.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, if you were going to try to be literal, you'd have to say, well, there wasn't 195 breeds of dogs in Noah's day. There was probably 3 different kinds. I mean, see, you could just spend so much time on that you miss the fact that in this story, God wants to be in relationship with God's people. And I think that's the thing that you really have to come away, and from so many of the stories, whether it's this one or the prodigal son or whatever, you have to come away with the idea that even that long ago, even though they still were trying to figure out who God was and why God seemed to be throwing lightning bolts on one day and throwing them rainbows on the next day, they were trying to understand who this God was and why their God, the one that they worship and read about and believed about, was different than some of the other gods that seemed to be out there.
Ralph has been, he's mentioned it several times to me about, and isn't it interesting, the well-known people, and I can't even think who they were now, who have spent millions of dollars looking for the ark.
Right.
These have to be people who took it absolutely literal.
Right. Yeah. There certainly aren't those. But. So I guess the question is, it's kind of like Bunny said in that class on theology one day, we all have to sort of find our own place in theology, and we always have to find our own place through the scriptures. You have to decide for yourself, and it's not that you're going to decide for anybody else, but you have to decide, what am I going to do with this story? Is this a story that's going to be life-affirming and life-changing to me somehow, and a story that's really valuable, or is it a story that I'm just going to say, well, it was there, but I just don't understand it, and so until I understand it, I'm not going to worry about it. You know what I mean? Yeah, Leonard.
I think modern science has pretty well broken up the myth, because they have earthquakes underneath the ocean. They can have waves come up 20, 30 foot high and wipe out islands and go way up into the continents.
Right.
And to somebody who didn't know, that would look like it was something from God, because they couldn't figure out why it came.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's what these folks are struggling with. There are these things that we have to find a cause for something. We always want to find a cause for something. I have a thing on my bulletin board at home that sits above my desk that says, why is that? And sometimes that drives me nuts. Sometimes it's a neat thing to want to know why that is, why it works, how come it does. But the other times it just drives me nuts, because you can drive yourself crazy trying to figure out, why is that? Why did that happen? So it's both a curse and a blessing. Sometimes
Also, the known Earth was so small, according to what we have now, and the population was in one small place.
Yeah, but yet there's, like Melinda said, there are flood stories from Africa, there's flood stories from China, there's flood stories from India, there's flood stories from Mesopotamia, there's flood stories from South America. That's right. So people must have been around in these.
It was the Tower of Babel. When they all got confused language, they all went everywhere, but they remembered that story.
Yeah, that's right. In whatever language they left the Tower of Babel with. All right, our time is up for this morning, unless somebody's got a burning question or insight. Next week, we're going to look at at the first part of the big fish story, and then I guess we do that two different weeks, the big fish story. So
Probably how can a fish really swallow a man and they survive for 3 days?
and again, you're going to be wrestling with how literal do you need to take that to walk away from that story with some value. That's the question.
There's value in that story.
There is value in that story. In fact, I love that story. There's a lot of good things in that story. So if you get too hung up in the literal part of it, you're going to walk away and not really get what I think is the meat of that story. So we'll look at that some next week.
I think maybe we need to look at, this was written by the Jewish people for the Jewish people.
Right.
From the stories they had gathered all around. Maybe the Old Testament should be looked at like that, and that's a lesson we should learn, and they consider it fables with a moral.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we use the word myth, and it sometimes has a bad connotation, but if you look at a more historical definition of myth, it's not a bad thing necessarily. It's not some made-up thing. It's legend or something that had some value, and that was why it was kept and passed on. I mean, that's the thing.
Like Cinderella. You read that story, and you got this good moral. You read Nasty Stepsisters, and you're going down.
Right.
You be this good, sweet, kind Cinderella, and you're going to marry the prince.
All right. Let's go have some fellowship and come back up for worship in a little bit. You want to read the line for me this morning? Good. Just read it. Just that one line.